We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
Would you like to live in a world ruled by one government? A world with no borders and a global economy? A world where all nations and their cultures can try to unite and coexist under the rule of the United Nations? Or would you fear the possibility of that central order having too much authority over the world? Is having nation-states or nationalism the best way to maintain stability and the best way to have a government that represents the interests of the people it serves? Others might even think that even smaller government is better. Globalism is a term we've heard a lot lately.
We will no longer surrender this country or its people to the false song of globalism. The nation-state remains the true foundation for happiness and harmony. Americanism, not globalism, will be our credo.
Globalism is a centralized global political structure. In other words, globalism is what the former director of the CIA and 43rd U.S. President George H.W. Bush proposed in the clip you saw in the intro. A new world order where all nations are under the plan or rule set forth by the UN. Some would say that sounds like it could lead to tyrannical world domination, while others simply see it as global prosperity. Globalism versus nationalism is the fight occurring throughout the world and explains the conflict between the Russians and the US. But who is the aggressor? Vladimir Putin says they recognize the US is the only superpower in the world, and they're fine with that. Take a look at what Putin has to say about US relations. But from what I can see right now, and that which I spoke about in Munich, that is not cooperation. Sometimes I feel the US does not want allies, they only want vassals. But we do want and we will develop relations with the US. I can see now that even within the US itself, there are transformations taking place. The US public, for the most part, no longer wants to be the world policeman. In part 1 of Red Scare 2.0, I showed a clip of the former NATO commander, General Wesley Clark, talking about the US deep state planning to take down 7 Middle Eastern countries in 5 years, only 9 days after 9/11. Even though it hasn't been accomplished in that time frame, the US has largely carried out those plans by overthrowing Iraq, the toppling of Libya and the murder of Muammar Gaddafi.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
The civil war in Yemen, and the funding and arming of Syrian rebels to destabilize Syria. We know the respected general wasn't lying in that interview from March of 2007. If fighting terrorism isn't the reason we are in the Middle East, then why are we actually there? In the same interview, General Wesley Clark explained what the purpose of being in the Middle East is. Take a look.
The truth is about the Middle East is, had there been no oil there, it would be like Africa. Nobody is threatening to intervene in Africa. The problem is the opposite. We keep asking for people to intervene and stop it. And there's no question that the presence of petroleum throughout the region has sparked great power involvement.
So according to General Wesley Clark, the US was looking to take down governments in order to control the world's energy production. In my previous video, we talked about how the West funded rebel groups like the Free Syrian Army and ISIS in order to topple Assad's regime in Syria. Why would the US topple Syria's regime? The answer is a pipeline. Well, actually, 2 giant pipelines. Now, a lot goes into this, but I'll put it as simply as I can. Russia supported the pipeline in the red. In Sunni kingdoms, which are the US allies of Saudi Arabia and Qatar, supported the Qatar-Turkey pipeline in purple. Starting in 2000, Qatar proposed to build a $10 billion pipeline through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, and Turkey. In 2009, Assad announced that he would refuse to sign the agreement to allow the pipeline to run through Syria in order to, quote, protect the interests of our Russian ally. That sounds pretty reasonable. According to a US EIA report, Russia sells 70% of their gas exports to Europe, and Russia doesn't really make much money from anything else. So the opposing Qatar-Turkey pipeline is not something that would benefit Russia. In fact, Politico reports that Putin views the Qatar pipeline as a NATO plot to change the status quo, deprive Russia of its only foothold in the Middle East, strangle the Russian economy, and end Russian leverage in the European energy market. Russia fears over its own independence and dominance in the region. Once Assad rejected the Qatari pipeline, military and intelligence planners quickly reached the conclusion that an uprising in Syria would be a good thing. The Washington Post reported the Secretary of the State, John Kerry, told a congressional hearing that Sunni kingdoms, like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, had offered to foot the bill for a U.S. invasion of Syria to eliminate Bashar al-Assad. Kerry said, in fact, some of them have said that if the United States is prepared to do the whole thing the way we've done it previously in other places, like Iraq, they'll carry the cost. Kerry reiterated, with respect to Arab countries offering to bear costs of an American invasion to topple Assad, the answer is profoundly yes, they have. The offer is on the table. So the Saudis were begging and essentially bribing the US government to eliminate Assad for not accepting their pipeline. In 2011, the US joined France, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and England to form the Friends of Syria coalition, which formally demanded the removal of Assad. The Washington Post reported that the State Department was secretly providing $6 million to Barada, a British TV channel, to support propaganda to rally public support of eliminating the Syrian president. Like I mentioned in Part 1, Saudi intelligence documents published by WikiLeaks shows that by 2012, Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia were arming, training, and funding radical jihadist Sunni fighters from Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere to overthrow Assad's regime. It's starting to look like we are serving Saudi interests and creating terrorism to eliminate their competition. There is even evidence that shows officials within the Saudi government may have been caught funding the cataclysmic event that started this entire never-ending war on terrorism in the first place. That event was 9/11. According to the infamous 28 declassified pages from the 9/11 intelligence report, the report shows the FBI didn't further investigate those allegations because they found that Saudi government funding of 9/11 to be of, quote, little practical significance, end quote. I will cover those 28 pages thoroughly in a future video. My sources are always in the description, including this declassified document that congressmen and senators spent years trying to declassify because they were outraged over this fact. So, one of our biggest allies in the region was possibly caught funding the most heinous act on American soil, and the FBI, or Deep State, didn't find it significant enough to look into. Now, when you put all of this in context, it's terrifying. The Saudis are paying off our politicians to fulfill this foreign policy, but as a US ally, that doesn't stand a chance against our military power. Why would they commit an act of war on the US? Why would they risk that? Unless they knew they wouldn't face any retaliation. And why would the US create these destructive terrorist groups who hate Western culture? Whose interests are they serving, and why would they think an attack on US soil would benefit them? This is looking like a deep state carrying out its globalist agenda with impunity. And whether you believe in bigger government or a world order, I think we can all agree this shouldn't be tolerated. We are destabilizing and toppling Russian allies, either for Saudi interests or the interests of globalists. Either way, they aren't serving American interests or the interests of the rest of humanity. And it really looks like Putin is correct. We aren't looking for allies, we're looking for vassals. And something tells me Russia wouldn't back down, and a World War III would commence. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. I know a lot of this may come off to some as un-American, but in reality, this is everything but un-American. There is a deep state, or military-industrial complex, that has extended its reach and no longer attending to the interests of the American people they serve. They are orchestrating and waging wars to the highest bidder and putting American lives at risk abroad and at home for their geopolitical agenda. Government can become corrupted and be used against our interests regardless of your political beliefs. And that's why questioning your government is loving your country. If this resonates with you, then please share it everywhere. I feel like this is the context people need to make sense out of what's going on in the world right now, and it's a conversation we should be having. Part 3 of Red Scare 2.0 is coming up next, so subscribe for more videos that go beyond the mainstream.